In this video, we'll be doing a brief introduction to the process of photosynthesis. We'll take a look at the properties of light and take a look at pigments that are involved in photosynthesis, and then finally take a look at the chloroplast, which is the organelle that's responsible for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the production of organic compounds from inorganic compounds using light, and it involves the conversion of carbon dioxide into simple sugars. So in this process, carbon dioxide is being reduced to become a simple sugar, such as glucose. And photosynthesis is done by plants, by algae, and even some bacteria. So cyanobacteria are examples of bacteria that can perform photosynthesis. We need to take a little bit of time to explore what light is. Light is electromagnetic radiation, or EM radiation, and it travels in bundles of energy called photons. Now, we can't see all of the electromagnetic spectrum. Most of it we actually can't see. We can only see a very narrow band found in this region right here. That's known as the visible spectrum. If you go to the left of the visible spectrum, we're increasing the frequency and increasing the energy. And these wavelengths of light are considered dangerous if exposed to them in large quantities. And if you go to the right from the spectrum, we're increasing the wavelength, but then also decreasing the frequency and decreasing the energy. So infrared, microwaves, and radio waves are all examples of low energy radiation. So right here in this middle part is the visible spectrum. That's what we can see with our eyes. We can't see UV, X-rays, gamma rays, or the ones to the right either. Different wavelengths have different energy. So a wavelength is this amount of distance between two peaks of a wave in a photon, and that's measured in meters. So you can see that the range is quite large, all the way from 10 to the negative 14 meters all the way up to 10 to the power 4 meters. So radio waves have a very long wavelength and low energy and low amount of frequency. Frequency is the number of cycles per second that a wave travels in. And then when you have increased frequency, you have increased energy. So again, high energy waves would be gamma rays, and they have 10 to the power 22 cycles per second, whereas over here, much fewer cycles per second. The way we see color is a little bit confusing. So objects absorb light radiation. So white light is the combination of all the wavelengths of light, of all the visible light. And objects can absorb those colors. The colors that they can't absorb, they reflect. And that's the color that bounces back to us, and that's the color that we interpret the object as. So if we were taking a look at a green leaf, for instance, the combination of white, the entire electromagnetic spectrum would be hitting the leaf, but it's able to absorb everything but green. So then green light is reflected and the object appears green. That's how we see color. The chloroplast is the organelle that's responsible for photosynthesis. So this is found in plant cells that are involved in the process of photosynthesis. So you'd find a high quantity of chloroplast in, for instance, the palisade mesophyll of the leaf, because that's the portion of the leaf that's pointing upwards. It's like the mitochondrion, has two membranes, the outer membrane and the inner membrane. But the inner membrane in the chloroplast is not folded, it's smooth, whereas in the mitochondrion it was highly folded to increase surface area so that more electron transport chains could be packed in on the membrane of the inner membrane. With the chloroplast, the inner membrane does not have an electron transport system, so the need for increased surface area is not there, because instead chloroplasts have these little disc-like structures called thylakoids, and they're stacked up together. And one stack of thylakoids is known as a granum, so all of these combined would be grana. In between, there's little connectors to connect the different stacks together. These stacks, or these connectors, are called lamella. And then in the space around all the thylakoids, all that fluid-filled space, is the stroma. So the stroma acts very much like the matrix in the mitochondrion. Now back to these thylakoids, these little discs are important in photosynthesis in the light-dependent reaction, and they have an electron transport system embedded in the membrane of the thylakoid. And we'll spend some time talking about the role of the thylakoid and the thylakoid membrane when we talk about the light-dependent reaction. Plants capture the sun's energy using special light-absorbing pigments. The main pigment in photosynthesis is chlorophyll, actually chlorophyll A. There's also chlorophyll B, which is very similar and also can absorb similar wavelengths of light. So chlorophyll has two parts. It has a porphyrin ring, so that's this part right here, which is a little complicated fused ring structure. In the center, there's 4 nitrogen atoms here, and with a central magnesium atom in the middle. This part is where the light absorption happens. And then chlorophyll also has what is known as a phytol tail. So it has over 20 carbons in the tail. And basically it acts as a lollipop stick that sticks onto the thylakoid membrane and like raises up the porphyrin ring to allow it to absorb. So it embeds the porphyrin ring or the molecule into the thylakoid membrane. So that's chlorophyll. So just as an aside, I thought I would share with you the differences between chlorophyll and hemoglobin. So chlorophyll is the pigment that is responsible for absorbing light and sending that light energy into the production system to produce ATP. Hemoglobin, if you notice, is almost the same. It's very, very similar. This part is different right here, and there's a hydroxyl here, but almost identical, except for right here, there's an iron atom instead of the magnesium atom. And this molecule in hemoglobin, it binds oxygen in our red blood cells and transports oxygen through our body. So 2 very important molecules for survival of plants and then animals. Accessory pigments are pigments found in plants that absorb frequencies of light that chlorophyll is unable to. So like I said before, there's 2 different chlorophyll molecules, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. They absorb a slightly different wavelength complement of light, and we'll talk about that a little later. Then there's some accessory pigments known as carotenoids, which are orange, xanthophylls, which are yellow. Anthocyanins can be purple or red, depending on the pH of the system. We actually can use anthocyanins as pH indicators. But all of these pigments are added together in a green leaf. We just can't see some of them because the chlorophyll overpowers the rest of the pigments. However, in the fall, when deciduous trees are preparing to drop their leaves, they actually start breaking down the chlorophyll and into their component parts and reabsorbing that back into the plant. And when that happens, it leaves behind the other pigments that were there already. So we would get the beautiful reds and oranges and yellows that were there all along, but were being masked by the green of the chlorophyll. And that's why leaves change color. So this graph right here is showing the absorption spectrum of chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and the carotenoids. So this peak right here, this would be chlorophyll B, and it's showing peaks in like the 400 to 450 range, and then also in the like 680 to 700 range. And then chlorophyll A, similar peaks, just a little bit shifted to the right for the others. And then there's the graph for, or the peak for carotenoids. So you can see that these 3 pigments combined are really good at absorbing wavelengths of light between the 380 to 500 and some spectrum. And then again, between the 620 to 700 range, nanometer range. So these colors would be the blues and the purples, and over here would be more the orange and reds. So the parts that the plant isn't as good at absorbing would be in the green and yellow range. So plants are able to absorb here and here really well, but not so much in the green-yellow range. And that kind of makes sense because we know that plants tend to be green, so it would make sense that it can't absorb very well in the green range. Now this graph demonstrates the action spectrum of photosynthesis. So it's showing that the rate of photosynthesis is heightened in the 400 to 550 range or 500 range, and it starts to decline. And then it starts to climb again in the 600 to 700 range. So the action spectrum demonstrates that photosynthesis happens really efficiently in those two regions, but not so much in that 500 to 600 range. Very similar to the absorption spectrum. Now, if we put both of the graphs together, you can see that the action spectrum and the absorption spectrum, the peaks are very similar. So we can then infer that the reason for this is that the pigments are green, so we aren't able to absorb light in the green range. So photosynthesis does not happen very well in green light. Finally, we're going to take a quick overview of the whole process of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis occurs in two very distinct stages, not so many stages as there was in aerobic cellular respiration, but there are two stages. So the first stage is the light-dependent reactions, which is here, and the second stage is the light-independent reactions. And interestingly, the purpose for the light-dependent reactions is to produce ATP and NADPH, which are then used in the light-independent reactions. So they get used up, and then they return ADP and NAD+, so that the light-dependent reaction can happen again. So if we take a look, during the light-dependent reaction, light hits the thylakoids and causes a series of reactions. Water is converted into oxygen, and then ATP and NADPH are produced through an electron transport system. Then in the light-independent reaction, so this reaction does not require light, carbon dioxide is reduced to form simple sugars. So a 3-carbon sugar is actually produced in this process, the Calvin cycle, but they're then used to build bigger sugars. And then the energy from ATP and NADPH was used to do this, so then we end up with ADP and NAD+, so that go back to the light-dependent reaction, and this reaction happens over and over and over again. So they actually work like a cycle between each other. Now, one thing you will notice too is there's an electron transport system in this reaction, which is the starting point for photosynthesis. If you remember, there was an electron transport system in cellular respiration that actually was at the end of the process, and it went in reverse. So oxygen got converted to water, and we made a bunch of ATP. Then if you take a look at this is very similar to the Krebs cycle, except in the Krebs cycle we were breaking down the sugar to produce carbon dioxide, and then we were making ADP and NADPH in that process so that they could be fed into the electron transport system. So kind of an interesting pairing, reverse of the two processes. And we'll spend some time, perhaps another video, talking about the similarities and differences of cellular respiration and photosynthesis.